Hello, and welcome to At the Table, a podcast where we discuss topics related to the mission of the Du Bois Orchestra. I'm your host, Joe LaRocca, Executive Director of the Du Bois Orchestra. Today we'll be discussing the challenges of racial diversity in the world of classical music. With me to discuss this topic is Dr. Ian Saunders, accomplished bassist, Assistant Dean for Artistic and Social Change at Laundry School of Music, doctorate from the University of Maryland, Diversity Fellow from the Cincinnati Symphony, and former Associate Dean of Students at the Eastern Music Festival. How you doing, Ian?
I'm good. That is a glowing introduction. Thank you.
I wrote it down, so, all good. Now, as a musician of color yourself, what are some of the challenges that you've personally faced?
Well, it's probably not going to be a secret that there are a lot of musicians of color who sort of face financial barriers, right? And that's the thing in general, sort of across the board. I don't want to make wide sweeping assumptions, but that's the thing that sort of everyone sort of focuses on. I mean, playing an instrument, to be honest, playing a classical instrument is almost like going to the Winter Olympics. There's a reason why you don't see, a lot of people of color in the Winter Olympics. Those are they can be expensive, right? So just getting an instrument and taking lessons and doing all of those sorts of things is a tricky thing. I don't remember a time when I did not actually want to play the violin. I have always wanted to play the violin as far as I can remember. But when I went to my mom and I asked if we could rent a violin, which was only like $25 a month or something like that, that was too much for us, and that was a lot. So I actually had to wait until I was in the fifth grade until
Which is quite late for a violinist.
Yes. I had to wait for it to be subsidized so I could kind of take it out for free, and that was the only way I could do it. And even then, I still couldn't really afford lessons, but I practiced really, really hard, and I did everything, and I kind of maintained that. And so actually when I went to college, as you just brought up, fifth grade is really late to start on the violin. So it wasn't a lack of working hard. Sometimes there's this mentality that like you haven't gotten here simply because you didn't work hard enough. I worked really, really hard, but I didn't have the guidance and mentorship that so many people needed. Like I didn't do summer festivals. I couldn't afford them. I didn't do, prep programs and things like that. So actually when I went to Old Dominion University, that's why I switched to the bass. Because, one, the school needed a bass player and I needed money, so that sort of worked out. But I was also going to have the chance to take all of that hard work and actually have guidance from somebody, so I could start off on the right foot. It wasn't so much like bass is easier than violin. I don't think it is. But I had, from the beginning, I could build a foundation. And as you can see, like that foundation was integral in order for me to progress. But the other thing that I think sometimes people don't ask, everyone wants to know what musicians of color, they ask, how much is it to get them involved? But I don't think people ask the other question, which is how much is it for them to stay, right? I tell people all the time, it wasn't uncommon for, I'll just mostly say black kids, because that's what I'm most familiar with, right? It's not uncommon to get black kids into orchestra, right? It's uncommon to get them to stay, right? Because, as I said, it's just doing a lot of different experiences. I did all state and I did district and things like that. But as you go up and you see less and less and less of you start to think like, oh, this is a little weird. And that's a hard thing to sort of process. And then I remember distinctly when I went to school, like, for example, I struggled really hard in music theory. Why? Is because that the interface that I had used with music for all of my life all of a sudden didn't seem applicable. Like I grew up in the church and I played a lot of gospel music. If you write out gospel music, it looks like the antithesis of 18th century counterpoint, right? Like the way you resolve dissonances is like completely different, right? And so I had always heard music this way. Like I heard symphonies, but most of my interface with the word was this way. And so I would go in and I would struggle. And I would try, and sometimes I would hear progressions in the way that I heard them in the church, or I heard them on something, and I would say like, "Oh, it sounds like this," and they would go, "No, no, it doesn't sound like that." So, I felt like I had to compartmentalize who I was as an individual for years in order to learn Bach and Beethoven. Similar thing happened when I used to play like concertos, right? If I would play like the bel canto style, sort of way that I had always internalized music, right? And I would have teachers sort of say things like, "That's not good music making," which
Mm.
really making music is relative to the aesthetic itself, right? There's no like good way of making music, but that's the term that we often hear in like classical music, like that's bad music making, or you don't do that, right? When they're really saying like that's not how you should play this particular style.
Yeah, I heard a story once about somebody playing. I won't give too much away, just because this person wants to, I'm sure, would want to remain anonymous. They were playing an orchestra in a school, like not as a music major, and um, he was Hispanic and was basically immediately just thrown into the back of the section, right? And it took him a lot of proving himself to be say for the director to take notice and say, "Oh, okay, you actually belong in the front," because there wasn't really it was more auditions for entry and not seating so much. It was a little bit more open, and that really struck me as quite amazing. That not only was that happening, but that nobody thought, "Oh, this is weird," right?
Now I have gone to places like when I went to go audition for grad school. I have, sort of gone up to that front table where they get you your number and everything. And I've walked up with my bass, and I have had people say like jazz auditions are that way,
Wow.
and I have to go like I'm actually here for classical, right? But once again, that's kind of being assessed for this first over, excuse me, over the other thing. Even though my name is right there on the paper with where I'm going to audition for.
Right. And that brings me to another question too, is that I ask why classical music for you personally, but one thing I've often been asked in terms of somebody who wants to be more involved when it comes to helping with social justice, people ask me why classical music,
Hmm.
right? Because people often have this perception of classical music as unsavable,
Hmm.
you know, in terms of, because they're, you'll see things on social media and that,
Yeah.
but people being exposed for this or that kind of wrongdoing in classical music, number of directors, a number of university professors and things like that. And more often than not, people will say, well, this is to be expected in classical music. Why even bother? Right. So yeah, why is classical music a good vessel for which to help society, the greater society, deal with these challenges of racial diversity?
Mm. Yeah. Big questions. Good questions. Let me go back again to sort of that question why it was important for me. So most of my career has the problem that I've had have been around the culture of classical music, the actual art form itself, which is
Mm,
beautiful, has always attracted me because classical music is one of those mediums where I think in general music can kind of speak to who we are, right? Like for me, I feel like at any given time I might be a recipe of a lot of different emotions, right? And for me, of all the genres, classical music sort of speaks to that. Is maybe between all the instrumentation, maybe between all the colors, maybe between the forces working together. I don't necessarily view it as just like solely happy or solely sad or solely clubbing if that's your thing. If that's your thing, cool, right? But, maybe I might feel a bit of despair and inside of that there's maybe a little bit of happiness. Maybe I feel a little depressed, but there's a little bit of hope. But I there are things that I think about in the classical repertoire that actually sound like how I'm feeling,
mm,
right? And that's where I tend to find most of them. And I think that's the beauty when you have all those forces, all of those timbres, all of those instruments working together in that type of harmony, that they can express a sort of depth of human emotion and experience that's unique and unlike anything else. And when it comes down to it, as human beings, we all love, we all suffer, we all live. These are things that sort of unite all of us. And so music can be an interface to that. And the beautiful thing about classical music is that it has this ability to take these nuances and ways that we as individuals experience and interface with the world and put that into a language, a voice that is universally accessible. So the reason why I think this is important, as far as sort of racial reckoning and sort of being a societal means, is because if we can take these things beyond just the canon, which is the culture of classical music, beyond the canon of just sort of 20 composers that we have used to sort of say that this is the classical music culture, then I think you'll find a lot more perspectives that are nuanced and unique, and more importantly, you can see how these individuals are experiencing the world. And I think you can find that in symphonic repertoire if you give it the chance to do so.
But that's also interesting that you bring up, the fact that we use a very small number of composers in a quite relatively small repertoire to express what classical music is, and I feel like that's why it seems so inaccessible to people
Yeah.
in general, because it can become stale, it can become boring. You can only hear water music so many, or Handel's Messiah so many times
Hmm.
before it starts to just have a just to be a caricature of a rich people party in a movie or something like that.
Yeah, and that's the thing. If you have the if the bulk of your music is sort of defined by 20 composers, then it's a numbers game. How many people are you going to find that connect with that, right? Um, but the other thing about it, like I said, expressing these ideas and things. I mean, like for example, gospel music. I love gospel music. It's wonderful. But there are more ways to sort of express the black experience in America than through gospel music. It is just one of the mediums. There's gospel, there's jazz, but then you look at and you hear something like, lyric for string orchestra by George Walker,
Mm.
and you hear like, oh my God, yeah, all these other things that you're kind of hearing in these other mediums, and you hear it just in this string orchestra. It's like, yeah, it's there. Is like I completely relate to it in a way. Is I remember when I heard it, it was you know surreal, instinctual. Like it spoke to me in a certain way that as much as I like water music, um, you know there there's a sort of distance between Handel and I. Like people will make the argument like music is timeless, and it can be, but sometimes music has to be contextualized, and sometimes you have to spend time with it. But there's some music out there, given your background that you might have, that might speak to you immediately in a certain way, and that was just one of those examples of it doing that.
Absolutely, yeah. And you know when you talk about, especially like George Walker, like black composers from the early 20th century, I mean, talk about voices that were just totally suppressed.
Hmm.
And you know I feel like right now is when people are starting to figure out about Florence Price, for example.
Yeah.
And but it's been such a long time. It's such but it's such um a unique portrait of black voices in that time in America, right?
Hmm.
And yeah, it's a very interesting thing to bring up. So, what do you think an ideal world looks like for classical music?
Ooh, that's a pretty big topic. Mm.
I guess I can say, just to become a little bit more specific, you were a diversity fellow in the
Hmm.
Cincinnati Symphony, right? And this
Yeah.
is a good example of progress, right?
Yeah.
Um, how do you think? How do you think a program like that helps? And do you think more could be done by organizations like the Cincinnati Symphony or others?
Yeah, I'm gonna try my best to at least give some sort of concise answer for this approach. But starting with the fellowship that I attended was great. It was absolutely spectacular, right? And by that definition, I guess I could be considered somebody who went through the pipeline, right, from beginning to end. I was on the sort of front end, and I came out on sort of that professional spectrum. I think what those organizations and in general that they can do is something that we hinted at earlier, which is addressing those cracks in the pipeline to begin with, right?
Mm.
You got to be really careful that when you're kind of, helping individuals and fellowships and things like this, that you don't conflate intent with understanding, right? I mean, this was something that we had to fight against a lot when we were just, talk about things, not necessarily specific to Cincinnati, but there would sometimes be this language to like we're helping minority musicians, and when you say majority minority, it makes this binary, as if the minority aspect and experience of America was just the opposite of the white aspect. But really, the people who make up the minority are as disparate and vast as anyone else. So when you're addressing the needs and things that they need in that sort of pipeline, I think you have to really step back and make sure you understand and that you're listening to the people who actually are saying things. That was another thing too. One thing I valued about Cincinnati is that they listen, which seems like is actually a novel idea or like a standard, but it's not always the case, right? To actually be listened to as a person of color is not, I find, always the case. And I wish I could say that more, but it simply happens where people go, yeah, yeah, yeah. And then you see your face on a poster and you see yourself here. But you realize like no one ever actually stopped and said, like, how do you feel about this? You know what I mean?
Right.
And that's the same thing with those sort of programs. When you put those programs together, those El Sustainment, those after school programs, the symphony reaching out, make sure at the end of the day you realize who those programs are for in the first place. It's not to make the organization look good and like they're actually out in the community. It's about the kids. And I have to say, I've been on the the other end more than enough times to feel a little bit like, is this for me or is this for you? Kids pick up on that very quickly.
Right,
So I,
because I think that organizations can fall into the trap of having that be something that makes the organization seem more prestigious rather than
yeah,
thinking about people involved. Right.
correct, correct. So because I know there's always this thing of like we're putting programs together, we're doing the pipeline, but we're not seeing results. And once again, I challenge organizations to make sure, don't assume that because your intent is manifesting in a way that helps people because you understand. Because a lot of times, some of these organizations might not have diverse boards or leaders in the first place. And the reason significance why you need a diverse board, because no one person is going to be able to take account of all the vast and nuanced experiences, nor one person should have to, right? That seems ludicrous. So that's the importance of having that in the first place. And I think if you have it at the top, especially in leadership, you'll see that trickle down in certain ways. So that's one. I think that'll help with the appearances on the stage. And I think by doing that, you also sort of see a little bit of a difference in your audience as well. But I think once again, having your leadership sort of be diverse at the top, that'll help with programming, because that way you can avoid programming things as like a novelty, because people pick up on that too. And what I mean by that is just like, like we're doing Black people this week away from the subscription concerts and away from the Masterworks series, and we're going to do George Walker in February, and then we'll check that box and we'll move on. Like, people are not dumb, right? And
Right.
so, yeah, yeah. If you have leadership that reflects that, I think you'll catch a lot of those different things. And then at that point, I think you'll start to see a change. So I guess it's multifaceted, but talking myself through that process, I think it starts if you have people in charge of these arts organizations that look and represent the communities that they serve in the first place. You might be able to have classical music in a better place, particularly in something, it's kind of crazy now. I think a lot of orchestras are kind of realizing that the stop that they built in the community might not be what they thought it was, right? Um, some of those are kind of coming home to roost in certain ways, right?
Right. Well, and that kind of answers the question from before, whereas like what does the perfect world look like for, a open and diverse classical world, in that it would, you wouldn't have these situations where we're just separating off, diverse or underrepresented composers into different concerts, but have it be just unquestionably included in the core repertoire.
Yeah,
Right.
that kind of goes back to that whole systemic thing again, right?
Right.
When we say the term masterwork or subscription concert or pops concert, I mean, this is traditionally how maybe seasons have gone for a while, but that's just a natural way to sort of segregate composers if you think about it, right? Because what tends
Mm,
to happen, a lot of times black composers end up on a pops concert in February,
right.
and then what does that say? They should be integrated into the canon. Personally, I think you can kind of get rid of masterwork and subscription and pop in the first place, because there's also this connotation that if it's on pop, somehow this composer is not as serious as another composer, and that might even be just within that world. So there's once again there's this natural segregation of where things should line up, and when you put them there, it sort of delineates that further.
See, now I can just imagine somebody who works for a large symphony orchestra listening to this and being like, "Yeah, but Beethoven 9 gets people in seats, right? Uh Dvorak ninth gets people in seats, right?" So so that's the interesting thing about it is you have these short-term needs that have to be met. So it seems like a pretty big risk to make a big change like that for a lot of ensembles,
Yeah,
to their defense a little bit.
I can definitely hear people saying that Beethoven 9 gets people in the seats, but I think if you find that you have to program Beethoven 9 every season, then you might realize that you got an actual problem, right?
Right.
With
That
the
there's something
repertoire.
deeper you have to get to.
Correct. Beethoven 9 is just a band aid for that moment.
Right.
That way. And if you want to be pedantic, you could program Beethoven 9 by itself. It doesn't need anything else on the program. But at the end of the day, you can't next week, it's about showcasing a wide variety of things. I mean, I'm not going to argue that Beethoven 9 isn't
Mhm.
a great symphony in the first place. Sure, but as we said before, um, if you're just trying to get people in the seats and you're just talking about business, which is, if you want to get cold and calculating about that, then if you're going to talk about it from a business perspective, the best way to sustain your organization is to diversify the experiences offered by your organization in the first place.
The next thing I wanted to ask or sort of discuss is the audition process. Now, have you taken any big, large symphonic auditions throughout
Oh
your
yeah.
experience? Yeah.
Hmm.
The one thing that's interesting to me is that people often talk about this notion of blind auditions, right?
Hmm.
Where, you know, usually the process is first you send a CV, right? To make sure that people, to make so that the line isn't out the door, right? But
Yeah.
to me, that kind of opens the door for almost, it kind of takes away the point of having a blind audition, right?
Hmm.
So I guess my question is, how do you think? What do you think the audition process in orchestras should be ideally? Because to me, right now, it doesn't seem like they're particularly blind, especially if you have a CV round where they make sure you went to the big conservatories and everything like that, and just a cursory Facebook uh, search or Google search can let them see you
Hmm.
automatically. So that can kind of open the door for any kind of, they, whether or not they're inherently racist or anything like that, which is probably less than it was back in the 20s. But um, there could be some subconscious bias that they have
Yeah.
there. So what do you think would be a better process or a better way of changing that?
Yeah. I mean, this topic is something that uh, you can split the world into two parties on this one, right? And I can't speak on behalf of anybody but myself, but based off a lot of conversations I've had, the audition process is the interesting one, right? Because by it being a screen, it professes to be a democratic process because they can't see you, right? As a side note, I would say that the audition with a screen can be a very democratic process. But it depends on how it's carried out. Now, the CV, you're right. They can look up the your name and things like that pretty quickly. I don't know how many committees are doing that
Mm.
where you get it in 200, 400 applications. So unless your name directly sort of indicates who you are, I find that really most of the time the problem, and this is based off of conversations I had with other people of color, is that the screen doesn't stay up, right? And so, and orchestras don't have a universal rule about that. So some orchestras, like the Met, it'll stay up the entire time.
So even in
But
the final round, you mean?
yeah, it'll stay up in the final round. But some orchestras, it'll come down. And then that's when some
Mhm.
hairy stuff tends to take place, right?
Well, and
And that's,
oftentimes people are pushed to the final round too, right?
yes, yes. So, if it were carried out universally, this is my concise way of saying that. If it were carried out universally, where it was the screen was up from the whole time, then that would be a better process. But that's something that isn't always the case, and that's where a lot of musicians of color sort of find that problem and find that things are starting to sort of happen that are a little bit weird in the first place. So. For me, my money is keeping it up the entire time. I know maybe there might even be people listening to the podcast that say like, "Well, how will I know if they move a lot when they play, and how would they do certain things like that and stuff like
Mhm.
that?" So, to which I say, it just sounds like you're fishing for something. But, um, yeah, I would keep it up the entire time that way for me to make that process a little bit more democratic in the first place.
Absolutely, yeah. And it's, one of the things I wanted to bring up earlier too is that it's difficult to have this conversation about racial diversity in classical music without talking about the economic end of it, right? Because wherever you come from, whatever race you are, if you don't have the ability to find the financial means, right, to become a solid classical musician, then it becomes very difficult. And of course, there are a million ways that can work. I mean, you can be a good musician and be playing on an intermediate instrument, but at the end of the day, if someone has your same level of ability and is playing on a better instrument, it's just going to sound better. Or if they, were able to go out and fly around and do all these master classes, because you do have fully funded programs, right? Like Curtis and Colburn and Yale and stuff like that. But it's still like the people who get into that are the people who spent 60 grand a year at Interlochen beforehand, right? Or something
Yeah.
like that, or at least spent a lot of money to do that.
Yeah, but I
You know?
think, but the other thing about that aspect is, so economics are definitely a big thing, and a lot of times, um, that in and of itself is the barrier to entry, right?
Hmm.
And then once you have that, I think what comes next, which is just as important, um, to kind of take a side note, I always hated that Carnegie Hall phrase, right? Like, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice,
Oh, yeah.
practice, practice. And which is not true, right?
Right.
I think it should be like, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, perseverance, and guidance, right? You need to find that guidance in the first place. Someone who actually sort of is familiar with that situation, understand that situation, and can sort of give you that path, right? Or let you see how that takes place in the first place. So that's the other thing. Because without that, I mean, without that sort of infrastructure in place in the first place, that's going to be very difficult to overcome. Even if you do have the financial means, without having that infrastructure, that vision, that someone who can work with you, someone who can guide you through that sort of process, that's going to be very difficult to overcome. There's always going to be that prodigy that just seems like no matter what happens, they're going to figure it out. But we shouldn't measure based off of exceptions, right? Right.
Right.
There's always going to be exceptions. There's always going to be just someone who just seems destined for it, and great, that's wonderful. But by and large, like the standard, like where you're coming from, yeah, there's a big difference between like if you grow up in an affluent community and you start playing, and then it's something that's sort of casual, and then you take it seriously.
Mm.
And then you might have someone like me who started so late and really wanted to play, but just never had the means and just had to wait. I mean, by some measure, I consider myself really lucky because when I went to college, I just happened to find mentors, which is not always likely. I happened to find mentors who were just as invested in me as I was in my own future. Because at that point, I wouldn't say I had the financial means, but I was in college, and so I had some more resources at my disposal
Mm.
than I previously did. But I still needed all of my teachers were individuals who I would have a lesson with them. And then after the lesson, they would say, well, come by the house and we'll play some more. And with one of my teachers, I used to play for 5 or 6 hours a week with them just to try to catch up, right? And it's like, that's the type, you need those mentors. And I think that's what's sort of missing, right? A lot of these programs, they just go into these communities and they just interact with these kids for 30 minutes and they expect that that's going to actually translate into numbers. That's not how that works at all, right? You need people who with a sustained presence in those communities in the first place in order to see those results manifest.
Absolutely, yeah. So, yeah, it seems like the most effective way of addressing these issues is having these is individual effort from
Yeah.
musicians to actually go out and do this. Great. Well, we covered a lot.
We
So,
did.
Yeah.
Go team.
Thank you so much for being here.
Well, thank you for having me.
And that was At the Table, brought to you by the Du Bois Orchestra. And I'm your host, Joe LaRocca, Executive Director of the Du Bois Orchestra. You can find more information about the Du Bois Orchestra at duboisorchestra.org and on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you so much for joining us.